great power competition, particularly U.S. competition with China. Trump may take a bit of a harder line on China than Biden, but on the whole, I think that if Trump were to return, we would probably see a continuity in policy when it comes to this focus on needing to counter China, compete with China. But when it comes to a country like Russia or even North Korea, we saw when Trump was last president that he was willing to try to push the envelope a bit. This is a big question, not only if a return of President Trump would have an impact on U.S. policies in the Middle East, which have been very unpopular in the Biden era, as seen by many around the world, but more so the broader shifts that we could see in U.S. foreign policy in the world on the whole if there were to be a return of President Trump. What we've heard to this point from President Trump is that he would really take an even more assertive position than President Biden has vis-a-vis the war in Gaza. I think this is someone that if he were to return would probably be not at all ashamed about increasing support to Israel for its war. I'm not necessarily convinced that a return of President Trump would mean a U.S. position that would try to get the Israelis and the Palestinians to stop their fighting. But I think at the end of the day, this is something that we don't know. And this gets to a bigger question that it's very hard to predict President Trump. We saw when he was president the last time, his policies were radically different from previous presidents, both Democrat and Republican. We might be led to believe that there'd be a major shift from Biden once again, including in the Middle East, where I think one might see a policy that would be much more focused on encouraging Israel to continue its war, but we don't know. It's interesting, we talk about the strong differences between the two men and their views, but I actually think when it comes to foreign policy, there's a fair amount of convergence, especially the most prominent issues in U.S. foreign policy today. Great power competition, particularly U.S. competition with China. Trump may take a bit of a harder line on China than Biden, but on the whole, I think that if Trump were to return, we would probably see a continuity in policy when it comes to this focus on needing to counter China, compete with China. One big difference that we could expect would be the same difference we've had in the past when it comes to how the U.S. chooses to engage with its allies and partners. There had been a strong bipartisan view for many years in the U.S. that it's important to maintain and strengthen existing alliances, the NATO alliance in Europe and the treaty allies in Asia. But of course, President Trump took a very different view, and he basically argued that we don't owe these allies anything, particularly if they're not willing to pay their bills as part of the alliances and so on. It remains to be seen if we would see that again if Trump were to return. But based on the messaging that we've heard from him on the campaign trail and elsewhere, I think it suggests to me that we could face some new challenges for U.S. relations with its allies and partners. And linked to that, the other question is, would he try to take a very different position toward traditional U.S. rivals and competitors, not China? That I think you would see continued competition, even confrontation at times. But when it comes to a country like Russia or even North Korea, we saw when Trump was last president that he was willing to try to push the envelope a bit. Iran would be, I think, different from Biden in the opposite sense. I think that Trump would take a very hard line on Iran. We've seen the Biden administration take a much harder line on Iran than it had when it first took office. But I think there you'd see similarities with the two administrations. It's tough to say because we don't really have a good sense as to what a Kamala Harris foreign policy would look like. Her roles in the U.S. have largely been domestic. Of course, she was she was a member of Congress. She was a prosecutor at one point. And then as vice president, she really has had a relatively limited portfolio, and what portfolio she has had have been focused on some pretty controversial issues, immigration, border control. One could perhaps have a sense as to what her position might be toward those issues when it comes to what she thinks about, the war in the Middle East or what she thinks about Russia, Ukraine. Clearly one could assume it's a position very similar to what Biden has had, but we don't yet have enough of a sense. And let's not forget that at one point Kamala Harris was a presidential candidate in the 2020 election, but even back then, we didn't really get a good sense as to what type of foreign policy she would want to have. But I would assume that it would be quite similar to that of President Biden, which I think really reflects the establishment position within the Democratic Party when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. That includes, emphasizing U.S. leadership, U.S. alliances, and that type of thing.